When John lost his uncle, a fellow veteran, he didn't inherit money or a home. He inherited a lonely hill no one wanted, no power, no plan, just summer heat, and an old dog. John came only to clean out the old cabin and leave, but his dog suddenly stopped, pressed himself to the ground, and refused to move. Following the dog, John uncovered a hidden space inside the cabin. Inside was a half-finished drawing of a stair-step home carved into the hill, with just a few handwritten words from his uncle. "Don't build up, go down." Why would a dog lead him there? What was his uncle trying to finish before he passed away? And could something buried in that hill save an entire town from the heat? Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The hill lay quiet beneath the weight of a summer afternoon. Tall pine trees stood still along the slope. Their shadows stretched long and uneven across the dry ground. The air was warm and heavy but steady, carrying the scent of resin, sun-baked needles, and old wood. It was the kind of silence that didn't rush a man, only waited. John Miller did not come to the hill to begin a new life. He came because someone had to. He parked his aging pickup near the bottom of the slope and shut off the engine, letting the ticking metal fade into the quiet. At 48, John carried himself with the posture of a man shaped by labor and years of discipline. His shoulders were broad but slightly rounded, his movements careful rather than hesitant. Dark hair, once thick, had thinned at the temples, and a close, uneven beard traced the sharp angles of his jaw. His eyes were steady, observant, but carried a distance that came from long nights spent listening for things that never arrived. Beside him stood Buddy, an older German shepherd with a graying muzzle and a calm, deliberate presence, one ear standing tall, while the other bent slightly at the tip. Buddy scanned the hillside, without urgency, as if reading a place that John had yet to understand. The cabin revealed itself in layers as they climbed. It was a rugged, multi-level wooden lodge built to follow the slope rather than fight it, each level stepping upward with the hill. Weathered planks formed narrow decks and railings worn smooth by years of hands and weather. Two doors on the lower levels stood ajar, and higher up, a wide terrace held a simple table and chairs, left where they had last been used. The structure felt practical, handmade, shaped by necessity rather than comfort. This had been Robert's way. John's uncle had been a veteran too, quieter, more withdrawn, a man who preferred places that didn't ask questions. When the letter arrived announcing Robert's death, peaceful in his sleep, John felt a dull weight settle in his chest. There was no shock, only the realization that something unfinished had been passed on to him. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust, sun-warmed wood, and something faintly metallic. There was no electricity, no hum of appliances, only stillness. John set his duffel bag down and opened the windows to let light and heat move through the rooms. Buddy padded after him, nails clicking softly against the floorboards, his nose working the air with quiet focus. John's plan was simple: clean out the place, sort what could be kept, load the rest into boxes, stay a few days, maybe a week, then head back to town, find work, and keep moving. That was how life had gone since he left the service. Temporary jobs, temporary places, nothing that ever asked him to stay. He worked through the afternoon, sweat darkening the back of his shirt as he moved old tools, folded worn blankets, and stacked weather-bent chairs against the wall. Robert had been organized in his own way. Not neat, but intentional. Every object seemed to have been placed where it could be reached without effort, as if the cabin had been designed for efficiency rather than comfort. As the sun lowered and the light shifted across the floorboards, John became aware of a change in the quiet. Buddy was no longer inside. John stepped out onto the lower deck and scanned the slope. Buddy lay beneath the edge of the cabin's shadow, pressed flat against the earth. He wasn't resting. His body was alert, legs tucked, chest against the ground, eyes focused ahead. John walked closer and crouched beside him, placing a hand against the soil. It was cool. Not just shaded cool, but deep, steady cool, the kind untouched by the heat above. Buddy did not move when John called his name. Instead, his tail gave one slow, deliberate thump. The message was simple and unmistakable. This place mattered. John stayed longer than he had planned that evening. He brought water and food outside, and sat beside Buddy as the sun dipped behind the trees, the cabin glowing softly in the fading light. The hill no longer felt like a responsibility waiting to be finished. It felt like a question. Later, inside, Buddy led him toward the back wall of the lower level, nosing at a loose section of paneling near the floor. It took only minutes to pry it open. Inside the narrow space lay rolled papers, yellowed with age, edges brittle and curled. John unrolled the drawings carefully. Pencil lines traced a structure stepped into the hillside, level by level, designed to work with the slope rather than against it. Notes filled the margins in Robert's uneven handwriting. Measurements, angles, small reminders. One phrase stood out, written darker than the rest. Don't build up. Go down. John sat back against the wall, the papers resting in his hands, and the weight of the moment settled over him. This wasn't a dream or a passing idea. It was unfinished work, left behind on purpose. For the first time since arriving, the thought crossed his mind without resistance. Maybe he didn't have to leave right away. Outside, Buddy lay in his cool patch of earth, eyes half closed, breathing slow and steady, as if he had been waiting for John to notice what had always been there. Morning arrived on the hill without announcement. Sunlight filtered through the tall pines in narrow bands, warming the wooden deck in uneven patches while the lower ground remained shaded and cool. The air carried the quiet scent of dry needles and earth, the kind of stillness that made even small movements feel deliberate. John woke earlier than planned, not because of urgency, but because his body no longer felt the need to sleep in. He stood at the window for a long moment before moving, watching dust drift slowly in the angled light. Normally, by this hour, he would already be packing, folding, sorting, deciding what stayed and what went. Instead, he made coffee and set the mug down without drinking it, distracted by the absence of pressure. No clock on the wall, no deadline demanding attention. He noticed the silence before he noticed anything else. Outside, Buddy moved along the slope beneath the deck, his gait steady but careful. The German shepherd's coat had lightened with age, black softened by gray along the muzzle and shoulders. At nearly 8 years old, Buddy no longer charged through space the way he once had. He paused often now, nose close to the ground, reading the land the way John once read terrain maps. The dog stopped near the lower edge of the hill and remained there, standing still, ears angled forward, tail quiet. John finished his coffee and joined him. The ground beneath Buddy's paws felt different when John knelt to touch it. Cool just below the surface, even after a long, hot afternoon the day before. The shade lingered here longer than anywhere else on the slope. Buddy lowered himself to the earth and rested his chest against it, letting out a slow breath. John straightened, wiped his hands on his jeans, and filed the observation away without comment. He had learned long ago that not everything needed immediate explanation. The morning passed in steady work. John returned to the cabin and continued sorting through Robert's remaining belongings, moving with care rather than speed. The place felt less like a temporary stop now, and more like a workspace left paused mid-task. He stacked old crates, wiped down shelves, and set aside tools he recognized, items that had been cleaned and returned to the same spots for years. Robert had not been neat, but he had been precise. Nothing here felt forgotten. In a corner near the back wall, John found a canvas bag heavier than it looked. Inside were smaller items wrapped individually. An old field compass worn smooth at the edges. A pair of gloves repaired more times than replaced. A folded service jacket with faded patches stitched carefully back into place. John held the jacket for a moment longer than necessary, recognizing the quiet discipline in the way it had been kept. He folded it again and set it aside, not ready to decide its place yet. Buddy disappeared outside again. John noticed his absence only after the room felt too quiet. He stepped onto the deck and scanned the slope. Buddy stood downhill near a tall pine, circling once before sitting back on his haunches. The dog looked at the ground, then back toward John, not impatient, simply certain. John followed, boots crunching lightly over dry needles. At the base of the pine, the soil was disturbed, not recently, but intentionally, packed and reshaped by careful hands. John knelt and began digging, brushing earth aside with his fingers. The ground was cooler here, easier to work. After a few inches, his knuckles struck a metal with a muted sound. The container was a military-issue tube, rusted but sealed. John recognized it instantly. He twisted the cap free and eased the contents out slowly. Inside were rolled papers, thicker than the sketch he had found earlier in the cabin. Their edges were yellowed, stiff with age, but intact. He leaned back against the tree and unrolled them. These drawings were different, more complete, more deliberate. They showed not only structures but cross-sections of the hill itself, soil layers, shaded zones, drainage paths. Measurements were written in the margins, some crossed out and rewritten. Notes filled the empty spaces, Robert's handwriting uneven but confident. One sentence appeared more than once, pressed harder into the page than the rest. This ground stays cool. Going down is safer than going up. John studied the lines without trying to understand everything at once. He saw logic where others might see obsession. Robert hadn't been improvising. He had been observing, testing, adjusting. This wasn't the work of a man hiding from the world. It was the work of someone preparing to remain in it. John rolled the papers carefully and slid them back into the tube. He didn't feel excitement or disbelief. What settled in his chest was heavier than either, a sense that something unfinished had been placed back into his hands, not as a gift, but as a responsibility. The voice came from below the tree line. "Hello?" John looked up to see a woman standing near the edge of the property, hands visible, posture relaxed but respectful. She appeared to be in her early 40s, average height, with a slender build shaped by daily labor rather than exercise. Her hair, light brown with sun-faded strands, was pulled into a loose braid that fell over one shoulder. She wore work boots, jeans, and a faded shirt, practical and clean. Her face was lightly freckled, skin tanned by years outdoors, and her eyes carried curiosity rather than intrusion. "I'm Sarah," she said. "Hope I'm not interrupting." John introduced himself and explained who he was. Her expression softened when he mentioned Robert. "I live down by the creek," she said. "Robert and I traded supplies sometimes. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it mattered." She glanced toward the cabin, then at the slope beneath their feet. "He used to say this hill was different, that the ground held on to the night longer. Warned me not to build too far out in the open. Said the land would tell you where it wanted help." John listened without interruption. They spoke for a few minutes about small things, the heat growing worse each summer, the creek running lower than it used to, how shade mattered more than people realized. Sarah mentioned her teenage son, quiet and restless, and the way Robert had once checked on them after a storm without saying a word. When she finally excused herself, she nodded toward Buddy. "He's a good one," she said. "Dogs like that notice things before people do." After she left, the hill felt quieter than before. John returned to the cabin as the afternoon wore on, the metal tube tucked securely in his pack. He laid the drawings out across the table again, tracing the lines without fully committing to their meaning. The idea didn't rush him. It waited. He noticed how the plans followed the shape of the land instead of fighting it, how each level depended on the one below. As the sun dipped lower, the heat retreated unevenly across the slope. The shaded areas remained cool. The open ground held warmth longer. Buddy returned to his patch beneath the pine and lay there again, unmoving, as if confirming a conclusion John was only beginning to accept. That evening, John cooked simply and ate standing by the window. He didn't pack. He didn't make lists. He folded the drawings once more and placed them carefully beside the service jacket. The thought of leaving did not press on him the way it usually did. It waited, quiet, as if acknowledging that something else had claimed priority. Outside, the hill settled into dusk. Insects hummed. The ground beneath the pine held its cool, unchanged by the fading light. John stepped onto the deck and looked down the slope, imagining spaces carved not for comfort, but for shelter, for people who might need relief from heat rather than protection from cold. For the first time since his uncle's death, the weight in John's chest did not feel like loss alone. It felt like direction. The heat arrived before noon and stayed without apology. It settled over the hill like a heavy blanket, pressing against the cabin walls and lingering long after the sun had climbed overhead. John worked outside early, shirt already damp at the collar, tools laid out in the shade where he could reach them without stepping into the glare. He had decided to test the land, not to build yet, but to understand what his uncle had been measuring all those years. The slope looked stable at first glance, but it lied the way summer ground often did. John drove a wooden stake into the upper section of the hill and watched the soil give way almost immediately, the clay collapsing inward with a soft, dry hiss. He tried again a few feet over, then again, adjusting angle and depth the way experience had taught him. Each time, the result was the same. The earth held briefly, then shifted. Too much clay, not enough stone. A wooden structure raised upward here would always be fighting gravity and heat at the same time. Buddy watched from a short distance, head tilted, ears relaxed. His coat glinted in the sun, the black and tan dulled slightly by age, gray threading his muzzle. When John stepped back from the collapsing hole, Buddy moved downhill without being called and lay down where the slope curved inward, chest pressed to the ground. The dog exhaled, long and satisfied, as if he had reached the right answer before the question finished forming. John followed and knelt beside him. The difference was immediate. Just inches beneath the surface, the soil cooled his palms. The air felt steadier here, the heat less aggressive. John sat back on his heels and looked at the hill differently, not as a place to stand against, but as a place to move into. He thought of Robert's notes, the repeated line about going down instead of up. This wasn't stubbornness, it was adaptation. By mid-afternoon, Sarah appeared again, walking up the path from the creek with a careful, practiced stride. In daylight, John noticed more about her, the way her shoulders carried responsibility without tension, the faint scar near her left temple, old and healed. She carried a canvas bag over one shoulder and wore a wide-brimmed hat that shaded her eyes. Her skin had the even tone of someone accustomed to outdoor work, not reckless with sun, but not afraid of it either. "Figured you might be testing things today," she said, stopping where the shade reached. "You move like someone measuring more than he's fixing." John wiped his hands and nodded toward the disturbed soil. "Ground won't hold posts. Too much clay." Sarah crouched and pressed her palm to the earth where Buddy lay. "Cooler," she said. "Same down by the creek bank. Robert figured that out early. Said power outages weren't the problem, heat was." She spoke then of a summer 3 years back when the valley lost electricity for days. How people slept outside, how the creek became crowded at night, how Robert's cabin stayed quiet and closed. "He never bragged," she said, "but he offered water, shade, let folks sit on the lower deck without questions." John listened, filing the memory into place. That evening he spread the drawings again, this time alongside his own rough measurements. The more he studied them, the clearer the logic became. A stepped structure cut into the hill would reduce load stress. Each level would be supported by earth rather than fighting it. Heat would dissipate naturally downward, the ground acting as insulation instead of an enemy. It wasn't clever design, it was patient design. John remembered something else then, Robert's summers. The old man had lived through more blackouts than most, had seen storms knock lines down and leave the valley sweltering. He had planned for that reality, not the one people preferred to imagine. The next day brought more proof. A pickup truck struggled up the road and stopped near the lower trail. The man who stepped out moved with stiffness that suggested both age and habit. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a trimmed gray beard and deeply set eyes that had seen too much sun and too many decisions. His name was Mark Ellis, a retired county utility worker who lived alone 2 ridges over. He wiped sweat from his brow with a handkerchief and surveyed the hill. "Ed Sarah said you were digging," he called. "Figured I'd see for myself." Mark's manner was direct, not unkind. He listened while John explained what he had found, nodded when shown the soil tests, and squatted to inspect the slope where Buddy rested. "You build up here," Mark said, tapping the ground with his knuckle. "You'll chase cracks forever. You go down, you let the hill do the work." He stood slowly, joints complaining. Robert talked about this once, said he wasn't building a house, said he was building a place that wouldn't fail when everything else did. After Mark left, the idea no longer felt private. John spent the following days mapping the slope, marking where each level might sit, how deep the cut would need to be to reach stable temperature. He worked at dawn and late afternoon, resting through the worst heat. Buddy stayed close, moving from shaded spot to shaded spot, always choosing the cooler ground without hesitation. The dog's injured hind leg, a lingering stiffness from an old service incident, slowed him but never stopped him. John noticed how Buddy adjusted his weight, how he favored one side without complaint. It mirrored John's own body in ways neither of them acknowledged. One afternoon, a boy appeared at the edge of the property, watching quietly. He was thin, maybe 16, with dark hair cut unevenly and arms marked by faint sunburn. He introduced himself as Evan, Sarah's son. He didn't speak much, but his eyes followed the measuring tape and stakes with intense focus. When John explained what he was doing, Evan nodded once. "Heat sinks," he said, "like cellars." John smiled. Exactly like that. Evan stayed for an hour, handing tools, holding tape, saying little. When he left, he thanked John without being prompted. By the end of the week, the reason for the design felt undeniable. The hill could not support a traditional structure without constant maintenance, but it welcomed excavation. It rewarded depth with stability and cool. Robert's drawings had not been ambition. They had been acceptance. On the seventh evening, John stood at the top of the marked slope. The valley stretched below him in shimmering heat. Power lines ran thin against the horizon, fragile and temporary. He thought of the people down there, of summers growing longer and outages growing more frequent. He thought of the drawings, the notes written in steady hands that no longer held tools. Buddy came to his side and sat, close enough that their shoulders touched. The dog's breathing was calm, measured. "This is why," John said quietly, more to himself than to Buddy. "This is why he built it this way. The house would go downward because the land demanded it, because heat demanded it, because survival wasn't about standing taller, but about knowing when to step back and let the earth help." John picked up the shovel and drove it into the marked soil, the blade sinking cleanly. Below the surface, the ground waited, cool and steady, ready to hold what he would place inside it. The sound reached the hill before the machine itself did. A low, pulsing thrum that pressed against the air, steady and mechanical, growing louder by degrees. John froze where he stood, one boot planted on the marked soil, shovel resting loosely in his hands. The rhythm was wrong for this place, wrong for the quiet he had learned to expect. When the helicopter crested the ridgeline, red belly flashing briefly through the trees, the world narrowed without his permission. His grip tightened, his breath shortened. The helicopter passed overhead, banking toward the distant smoke rising beyond the valley. Fire suppression. Summer again. The sound should have meant safety. Instead, it dragged him backward through memory, through heat and dust and noise that did not fade when the machine disappeared from sight. His hands began to shake, subtle at first, then undeniable. Buddy moved without hesitation. The German shepherd crossed the space between them and pressed his body firmly against John's thigh. Weight deliberate, grounding. Buddy's fur was warm from the sun, his breath steady, his presence solid in a way the past could not erode. When John's knees weakened, Buddy shifted, nudging him downward until John sat on the cool earth, palms flat against the ground. The soil stole the heat from his skin. The shaking eased, inch by inch. John closed his eyes. He did not see the helicopter anymore. He saw desert light bouncing off metal, heard voices clipped by urgency, smelled fuel and dust baked into everything. He stayed still until the memories lost their edge, until Buddy's slow breathing gave his body permission to follow suit. When John finally opened his eyes, the sky above the hill was clear again, quiet reclaimed. "I'm good," he murmured, though he did not move yet. Buddy did not pull away. He stayed pressed close, amber eyes watchful, ears relaxed but alert. At nearly 8 years old, Buddy carried scars beneath his coat. One hind leg stiff from an old service injury, muscle rebuilt but never forgotten. He knew this moment. He had been trained for it once. He performed the task now without command. John rested his forearm against Buddy's back, feeling the steady rise and fall. It was then, sitting on the cool slope, that the thought arrived fully formed. Robert had heard helicopters too. John had known his uncle was a veteran. He had known the facts the way families often did. Service branch, years served, places never fully named. What he had not understood until now was how much of Robert's life had been shaped by the same quiet after effects John carried. Different war, different decade, same silence afterward. Robert had not built upward because he feared storms. He had built downward because he understood them. Later that afternoon, John returned to the cabin and opened the small metal box he had avoided until now. Inside were items Robert had not buried or hidden, things meant to be found eventually. Among them was a thin folder, edges worn soft. Inside were a handful of photographs and a folded letter. The photographs showed Robert younger, leaner, uniformed. His face was angular, jaw set, eyes already carrying the guarded calm John recognized too well. In one photo, Robert stood beside a half-built structure. Not this hill, but another place long ago. The caption on the back read simply, "Temporary." The letter was brief, written in the same uneven hand as the drawings. "If you're reading this, you stayed longer than planned." That's usually how it starts. John read the line twice. The rest of the letter did not explain the house or the plans. It spoke instead of endurance, of learning which battles were loud and which ones were fought quietly, of building things that lasted not because they were impressive, but because they were useful when everything else failed. John folded the letter and sat back heavily in the chair. Sarah arrived near dusk, her figure silhouetted against the fading light as she climbed the path. Her braid hung loose now, strands escaping around her face. Sweat darkened the collar of her shirt, and dust clung to her boots. She paused when she saw John seated, reading. "You all right?" she asked, her voice low, careful. John nodded once. "Just remembering." She did not press. Sarah sat on the edge of the lower deck, hands clasped loosely, gaze following Buddy as he lay nearby, head resting on his paws. In the softer light, her features seemed gentler, the lines at the corners of her eyes speaking more of patience than fatigue. She listened while John spoke, not about the helicopter, but about Robert, about the letter, about the realization that his uncle had not been hiding from the world. "He wasn't," Sarah said quietly. "He was paying attention to it." She told John then about the first summer she had met Robert, about a brush fire that crept close to the creek, how the power failed for nearly a week, how Robert had stayed put, doors closed, while others fled or panicked. "He didn't talk much after that," she said, "but he started digging not long after." John looked toward the marked slope. As the days passed, the valley grew louder with summer. Sirens echoed more frequently. Smoke drifted in thin lines across the horizon. Conversations down near the road changed tone, shifting from casual to cautious. People spoke of heat records and failing transformers. John worked steadily, cutting the first shallow trench into the hill, careful not to rush. Buddy remained nearby, choosing cool ground, watching every movement. One evening, Mark returned, bringing water and news. "County's stretched thin," he said, wiping his brow. "If this heat keeps up, outages are coming. People aren't ready." John nodded. He already knew. That night, as the air cooled unevenly across the slope, John sat alone with the drawings spread before him. He traced the lines again, understanding them now, not just as engineering, but as memory. Robert had fought his war and survived. He had returned and fought another, quieter, longer, just as demanding. John realized then that this house was not an escape. It was a continuation. Buddy settled beside him, placing his head against John's knee. "We're not hiding," John said softly. "We're preparing." The shovel waited near the door. The ground below waited too, cool and steady, ready to hold what the hill had been asked to hold before. John rose, rested a hand briefly on Buddy's head, and stepped outside. Two soldiers, two wars. One understanding passed forward, not through words alone, but through earth, patience, and a structure built to endure. The outage came without warning, the way summer failures often did. One moment the valley hummed with the dull comfort of fans and refrigerators, and the next it fell into a thick, breathless quiet. Heat pressed down harder in the absence of moving air, settling into homes and bodies alike. John noticed it first not by sound, but by the way Buddy lifted his head and stood, ears angled toward the road below. Smoke did not rise, sirens did not scream, but something was wrong. John had been working near the excavation when he heard shouting, voices carrying uphill, strained and uneven. He followed the sound down the narrow trail, Buddy trotting ahead despite the stiffness in his injured hind leg. At the edge of the road, a small cluster of neighbors had gathered around an older man, collapsed in the shade of a pickup truck. The man's name was Harold Pike. Harold was in his late 70s, tall but long, since bent by years of labor and gravity. His hair, once thick and dark, had thinned to silver wisps that clung to his scalp with sweat. His skin was deeply lined, sun-browned and dry, and his breathing came shallow and irregular. He lived alone in a small trailer further down the valley, a place that trapped heat like a tin oven when the power went out. He had been trying to walk to the creek when his legs gave out. John knelt beside him without hesitation. Harold's pulse was fast, his skin hot to the touch. Heat exhaustion, edging toward shock. John had seen it before. Different circumstances, different uniform, same urgency. He instructed the nearest neighbor, a heavy-set man with red cheeks and panic in his eyes, to fetch water and shade. Sarah appeared moments later, hair pulled back hastily, her face tight with concern. "He needs cooling," John said calmly. "Slow, steady." They worked together without argument. Water was poured over cloth and pressed gently to Harold's neck and wrists. Sarah held his head while John monitored his breathing. Buddy stayed close, pressing his body against Harold's legs, radiating calm more than warmth. The dog's presence was grounding, his steady eyes focused on the man, as if willing him to stay. Within minutes, Harold's breathing slowed. His eyelids fluttered open, confusion giving way to recognition. "Thought I was done for," he rasped weakly. "You're not," John replied. "Not today." The ambulance arrived shortly after, heat shimmering above the road, as paramedics loaded Harold onto a stretcher. As they drove away, the crowd dispersed quietly, shaken but relieved. Conversations fell into hushed tones. The outage would last longer than expected. Everyone knew that now. John and Buddy walked back up the hill in silence. Halfway up, Buddy stopped. He turned sharply toward the excavation site, tugging against the leash John still held loosely out of habit. The dog's movement was insistent, not frantic. John followed, puzzled, until they reached the partially dug level where the earth had been cut back into the slope. The temperature changed immediately. The air inside the shallow cut was cooler, noticeably so. Not cold, but steady. Calm. John stepped fully into the space and felt the heat drain from his skin. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. The difference was undeniable. Buddy moved to the back wall of the cut and lay down, chest against the dirt, tail thumping once before going still. This was where he chose to rest, where his instincts told him relief lived. John leaned against the packed earth and let his thoughts settle. For the first time, the idea came uninvited and fully formed. If Robert had finished this sooner, he did not finish the sentence. The thought wasn't accusation. It wasn't regret. It was recognition. Robert had seen the need coming. He had understood the summers would grow harsher, the outages more frequent. He had built not for comfort, but for moments like the one they had just lived through, when time and heat turned small problems into emergencies. John stood there longer than necessary, feeling the earth's quiet strength at his back. Buddy watched him closely, head lifted, eyes alert. The dog seemed to understand that something had shifted. Later that evening, Sarah came up the hill again, carrying a cooler and a stack of damp towels. Her face was drawn, but her movements were purposeful. "Harold's stable," she said. "Doctors say he'll be okay." John nodded, relief loosening something tight in his chest. She stepped into the excavation and paused, eyes widening slightly. "It's cooler here," she said, unnecessary but honest. John met her gaze. "That's the point." They spoke then about the valley, about who lived alone, who relied on machines to survive the heat, who would struggle the most if outages became longer and more frequent. Sarah mentioned a widow near the creek, a couple with an infant further down the road, Mark's arthritis worsening in extreme temperatures. "People think heat is just uncomfortable," she said. "They don't see how dangerous it is until it's too late." As darkness settled, the power remained out. Small generators buzzed in the distance, uneven and strained. John watched the lights flicker across the valley and felt something unfamiliar but unmistakable settle into place. Purpose. This wasn't about finishing Robert's project out of obligation. It wasn't about honoring the past. It was about preventing the next herald, about giving the valley a place where heat lost its grip. John worked longer that night, widening the cut just enough to improve airflow. Buddy stayed nearby, shifting occasionally to ease his leg, but never leaving the cool ground. The dog's breathing slowed as the temperature dropped further, his body relaxing into the earth as if it had always belonged there. Before turning in, John placed the drawings on the table once more. He added a single note of his own in the margin, careful and deliberate. This needs to be finished. Outside, the night remained hot, oppressive. Inside the cut, the earth held steady, patient and unchanged. Buddy lay at the entrance, eyes half closed, guarding the space without instruction. The incident with Harold had been small in the eyes of the world. No headlines, no lasting damage. But for John, it had stripped away any remaining doubt. This house wasn't optional, it was necessary. John did not redesign the house. That decision came quietly, without ceremony, on a morning when the heat returned early and heavy, pressing against the hill before the sun had fully cleared the trees. He stood over the drawings spread across the rough table, hands braced on either side, resisting the instinct he had relied on most of his life, the urge to improve, to adjust, to prove he could do it better. The lines were imperfect. Measurements faded in places, annotations half erased by time. Any builder with pride would have rewritten them. John did not. He followed them exactly, even when he did not fully understand why. He told himself it wasn't trust. It was discipline, the same kind he had learned when orders mattered more than opinion. Outside, Buddy waited in the shade, watching. The first days of real construction were slow and frustrating. John worked in the early mornings and late evenings, carving shallow cuts into the hillside, reinforcing edges with temporary supports. The earth responded differently depending on where he dug. Some sections held firm, cool and dense. Others crumbled unexpectedly, sliding inward with quiet insistence. Each failure tempted John to adjust the plan. Each time, he stopped himself. Buddy became his test. The German Shepherd moved deliberately through the work area, sniffing the air, circling spots before choosing where to lie. When John followed the drawings, Buddy settled easily, body relaxed, breathing slow. When John deviated, even slightly, the dog refused to stay. He paced, stood, moved uphill or down until he found calmer air. John began to notice patterns. Wind shifted differently along the cut. Heat pooled where it shouldn't. Buddy noticed long before John did. One afternoon, John tried to widen a section beyond the marked line, convinced he could improve airflow. He worked for nearly an hour before realizing Buddy had not followed him inside. The dog lay several feet back, blocking the entrance, his body stretched across the narrow path, head up, eyes steady. "Come on," John muttered, tapping his thigh. Buddy did not move. The dog was not stubborn. He was precise. John recognized that kind of refusal. He set the shovel down and stepped back. Within minutes, the difference became clear. The widened section trapped heat. Air stagnated. The earth radiated warmth instead of absorbing it. John returned to the drawing, erased his adjustment, and restored the original line. Buddy stood, walked forward, and lay down inside the corrected space. Sarah watched this exchange from the edge of the site one evening, arms crossed loosely over her chest. In the fading light, her features softened, the tension she often carried easing when she saw the dog settle. "You're letting him lead," she said. John wiped sweat from his neck. "I'm letting the plan lead." Sarah nodded. Robert was the same. He didn't trust shortcuts. She stepped closer, studying the drawings. Up close, John noticed the faint calluses on her hands, the thin scar across her knuckle. Someone who worked, who fixed things herself when she could. "People think pride is confidence," she added. "Sometimes it's just noise." As the structure deepened, progress slowed further. The work demanded patience John had not practiced in years. Every foot of depth required reinforcement. Every mistake cost time and energy. More than once he considered stopping for the day and not returning. The valley below shimmered with heat, generators buzzing intermittently as outages rolled through in waves. Mark came by one afternoon, carrying lumber and a battered cooler. He watched quietly as John worked, nodding occasionally. "You're doing it the hard way," Mark said finally. John didn't look up. "I'm doing it the right way." Mark smiled, the corners of his eyes creasing. "That's usually the same thing." By the end of the week, exhaustion crept in. John's hands blistered. His shoulders ached constantly. Sleep came in fragments, broken by heat and unfinished thoughts. One night, he sat alone at the entrance of the cut, staring into the darkness beyond the lantern's reach, wondering if Robert had reached this point too, this moment where effort outweighed certainty. Buddy lay beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You ever want to quit?" John asked quietly. Buddy's ears twitched. The dog did not lift his head. The next morning, John woke with a familiar tightness in his chest, the kind that followed too many restless nights. He began working anyway, pushing harder than he should have. He ignored Buddy's pacing, dismissed the subtle signs of strain. Pride slipped back in, disguised as determination. It cost him. The support beam shifted unexpectedly, sending a cascade of loose earth into the cut. John jumped back in time, heart racing, breath sharp. Dust filled the air. Buddy barked once, short, urgent, and moved in front of him, blocking the path again. John froze. Nothing catastrophic had happened. No injury, no collapse. But the warning was clear. He had pushed when the structure wasn't ready. He had worked against the plan instead of within it. John sat down heavily on the packed earth, back against the wall, letting the adrenaline fade. Buddy stood guard, body angled protectively, eyes scanning the cut until the air settled. "I get it," John said softly. "I hear you." He rested his palm against the wall, feeling the cool seep through his skin. The house was not asking him to be faster. It was asking him to be faithful, to the drawings, to the land, to the process Robert had started and left behind. That afternoon, Evan returned, carrying a notebook. The boy moved with quiet curiosity, dark hair falling into his eyes as he studied the structure. He asked questions, thoughtful ones, about airflow and depth, about why some areas stayed cooler than others. John answered patiently, explaining the logic without embellishment. Evan nodded, scribbling notes. "It's not about building," he said. "It's about listening." John smiled faintly. As the sun dipped low, the cut stood deeper and more stable than before. Not impressive to look at, not finished, but correct. Buddy lay at the back wall, fully relaxed, breathing slow and even. The dog had approved. John stood at the entrance looking down into the space that would one day shelter more than just himself. He thought of Harold, of the outage, of the people who would need this place when heat pressed harder than pride ever could. This house would not be a monument. It would be a tool. And for the first time since he began, John felt no urge to rush. The change was subtle at first, almost easy to miss if John hadn't been paying attention. There was no sudden rush of cool air, no dramatic shift that announced success. Instead, it revealed itself in degrees, in the quiet language of comfort rather than relief. John noticed it one late afternoon when he stepped down into the lowest finished level and realized he was no longer counting the minutes before he would need to climb back out. The air felt different here, not cold, not damp, but steady. The kind of steadiness that allowed the body to relax without asking permission. Heat still existed above ground. He could feel it the moment he stepped back into sunlight. But down here, it softened, spread out, lost its sharpness. The vertical ventilation shaft, cut precisely along the axis marked in Robert's drawings, was doing its work. Warm air rose slowly, drawing cooler air from below, the hill assisting without effort. Buddy discovered it before John trusted it. The German shepherd descended the steps without hesitation, nails clicking softly against packed earth and timber. He circled once, then lay down with a sigh that carried more weight than sound. His body stretched fully this time, not coiled or alert. His injured hind leg extended comfortably behind him. Within minutes, his breathing slowed into the deep, even rhythm John had rarely seen during the long summers. That's new, John murmured. For the first time since arriving on the hill, Buddy slept without twitching. That night, John stayed below ground longer than planned. He ate there, sitting against the cool wall, lantern light casting gentle shadows across unfinished beams. When he finally lay down on his cot, the heat did not press against his chest the way it usually did. His thoughts, often restless and sharp-edged, drifted without resistance. Sleep came quietly and stayed. He did not dream. Morning arrived without the familiar jolt of waking. John opened his eyes slowly, unsure at first where he was, then felt the cool air on his skin and understood. He checked his watch twice, surprised by the time. It was the first full night of uninterrupted sleep he had experienced in years. Outside, the valley shimmered with heat. John worked with renewed patience that day, not faster, but steadier. Each completed section improved the next. The house did not demand correction or force. It responded when approached with accuracy. The deeper levels held their temperature even as the sun climbed higher, the air moving gently through the shafts, as if guided by intention rather than design. Sarah visited in the afternoon, stepping carefully down into the lower level. She paused halfway, eyes widening slightly as she felt the change. "It's cooler," she said, almost incredulous. "Not cooler," John replied. "Calmer." She smiled at the distinction. In the filtered light, her features softened further. The brown of her eyes warm, the fine lines at their corners deepened by relief rather than strain. She had tied her hair back loosely, wisps escaping at the nape of her neck, her skin flushed from the heat above. "This would help people," she said quietly. "Not just for a few minutes, for hours." John nodded. That was the point. They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the faint movement of air. Sarah spoke then of Evan, how the boy had slept poorly since the outages began, waking often, restless and irritable. "Heat gets into his head," she said. "He doesn't know how to explain it." John understood more than he said. By the end of the week, the difference in John himself was undeniable. His movements grew more deliberate, less guarded. He ate more regularly. The tension that had lived between his shoulders eased, replaced by a grounded fatigue that came from effort rather than vigilance. Buddy mirrored the change, his steps lighter, his ears relaxed more often than alert. The house was not finished, far from it. Walls remained raw, supports temporary, the upper levels still exposed. But the structure had found its rhythm, aligned at last with the land rather than imposed upon it. Word traveled quietly. Mark came by one evening, sweat-soaked and frustrated after another day without power. He followed John inside without comment, standing still as the temperature difference registered. "Well, I'll be damned," he said finally. "Feels like stepping out of an argument." He stayed longer than planned, sitting on a crate, talking about transformers and load failures, about how the grid wasn't built for this kind of heat. "Places like this," he said, gesturing around, "they're going to matter more than people think." Later, two more neighbors appeared at different times. An older woman named Louise, short and broad-hipped, her white hair cropped close to her head, and a young couple passing through the area after their truck overheated. John did not invite them to stay. He simply let them feel the space. They lingered without explanation, relief evident in their posture. No one spoke of miracles. The house breathed quietly, doing what it had been designed to do. That night, John sat at the lowest level, lantern dimmed, listening. The hill creaked softly as temperatures shifted outside. Air moved upward through the shaft, consistent and unforced. Buddy slept nearby, fully on his side now, paws loose, a low, contented sound escaping his throat with each exhale. John rested his back against the wall and closed his eyes. He thought of Robert, of the patience it must have taken to observe the land long enough to understand it. He thought of the wars they had each fought, different in nature but similar in aftermath. This place was not healing him in any grand, dramatic way. It was simply allowing him to exist without strain. Sometimes that was enough. Above ground, the valley struggled. Sirens passed intermittently. Generators failed and restarted. Conversations grew shorter, more urgent. Down here, the air remained steady. When John finally climbed back up to the surface, the heat struck him again, sharp and unyielding. He did not linger. He returned below, with quiet certainty, knowing now that the house was no longer just a structure under construction. It was functioning. It was alive in the only way a building ever could be, by serving those who entered it without asking anything in return. The heat no longer arrived in waves. It stayed. Day after day, it settled over the valley like a held breath that refused to release. By mid-morning, the sun burned white through a thin veil of smoke drifting in from fires far beyond the ridge. The smoke dulled the sky and softened the edges of the hills, turning distance into a hazy suggestion rather than a promise. Even the birds were quieter. John noticed that first, the absence of movement where there should have been sound. By noon, the power failed again. This time, it did not flicker back. Fans fell silent across the valley. Refrigerators hummed once, then stopped. Houses that had been merely uncomfortable became dangerous in a matter of hours. John stood on the deck and watched the town below lose itself light by light, the small signs of electricity blinking out in the uneven clusters. The grid was retreating, piece by piece. Buddy stood beside him, still as a carved figure, ears angled toward the shifting wind. The German shepherd's coat stirred faintly as the breeze changed direction, carrying the scent of smoke uphill. Buddy lifted his head and let out a single, low howl, not loud, not panicked, but long and deliberate. The sound echoed briefly against the trees before dissolving into the thick air. John felt it settle in his chest. Tonight would be worse. He moved quickly, not rushing, but without hesitation. The house below ground was not finished, but it was functional. Cool air already pooled in the deeper levels, steady and reliable. John lit lanterns, checked the ventilation shaft, cleared the entrance path. Buddy followed him closely, nails clicking, posture alert but calm, as if aware that his role was about to change. The first knock came earlier than John expected. It was Sarah. She stood at the edge of the property, her face drawn tight, braid undone, and hair clinging to her neck with sweat. Her skin, usually warm-toned and even, looked flushed and strained. She held Evan by the shoulder. The boy's face was pale, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, eyes unfocused. "He's dizzy," she said simply. "And it's not cooling down." John nodded once and led them inside. The moment Evan stepped into the lower level, he sagged slightly, relief overtaking his body before his mind caught up. He sank onto a bench, breathing slowing as the cooler air wrapped around him. Sarah exhaled shakily, her shoulders lowering for the first time that day. "It's like stepping underwater," she murmured. "Everything slows." Word traveled faster than smoke. Within the hour, Mark arrived, sweat-soaked and grim, followed by Louise, leaning heavily on a cane, her broad frame moving with effort. Louise's white hair was damp and curling against her temples, her skin mottled red from heat exposure. She had lived in the valley for over 40 years and had never seen a summer like this. "Didn't want to be a bother," she said, voice strained, "but I couldn't catch my breath." "You're not," John replied. More came as dusk approached, a young mother named Carla, slight and sharp-featured, carrying a toddler whose cheeks burned with feverish heat. Carla's eyes were wide and exhausted, her voice clipped by worry. Behind her, an older man John recognized, but barely knew. Thomas Reed, mid-60s, tall and angular, with a gray beard trimmed close and hands that shook slightly from dehydration. He had once worked construction before. A fall ended his career early, leaving him proud but cautious about asking for help. John did not announce rules. He did not give speeches. He guided people down the steps, showed them where to sit, where to lie down if they needed. Buddy moved among them quietly, positioning himself near those who trembled or breathed too fast, his presence a steady anchor. When the toddler began to cry weakly, Buddy lay close enough for the child to reach out and touch his fur, the soft contact calming her almost immediately. Outside, the smoke thickened as night fell. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint orange glow of distant fire across the sky. Sirens wailed somewhere below, then cut off abruptly when generators failed. The valley was losing its defenses one layer at a time. Inside the house, the air held. Lanterns cast warm circles of light along the walls, shadows moving slowly as people shifted and settled. The deeper levels remained cool, the ground absorbing heat and releasing nothing in return. The ventilation shaft whispered softly, a constant upward draw that kept the air fresh. Sweat dried on skin. Breathing slowed. Panic softened into fatigue. John moved from person to person, checking pulses, offering water, speaking little. His face was calm, angular features set in the quiet focus he had once worn in entirely different circumstances. This was not chaos, it was triage. And unlike the battlefield, this was a place he could control. At one point, he climbed back to the surface to assess the conditions. The heat struck him like a wall, smoke stung his eyes. The town below was nearly black now, only a few scattered generator lights visible. He returned underground quickly, sealing the entrance partially to keep the hot air out. Buddy followed, pausing at the threshold to look back once more before stepping inside and lying down across the entrance path, a living barrier of fur and muscle. As midnight approached, the danger shifted from immediate to sustained. Heat exhaustion turned into dehydration. Children slept fitfully, then deeply. Older residents dozed in chairs or lay flat against the earth, bodies finally able to rest. Sarah sat beside Evan, brushing hair back from his face, her eyes closing briefly before snapping open again, unwilling to fully surrender to sleep. John noticed how the house held sound differently. Voices dropped naturally, movement slowed. The hill itself seemed to absorb more than heat. It absorbed urgency. Near dawn, Carla's toddler stirred and began to cry again, weak but alert this time. John knelt beside her, checked her temperature with practiced hands, then nodded. "She's cooling down," he said softly. "She's going to be okay." Carla pressed her forehead to the child's hair, tears finally spilling free. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carrying more weight than she intended. John shook his head gently. "Thank the ground." Buddy shifted beside them, tail thumping once. By morning, the smoke thinned slightly. The heat did not. Power remained out, but no one inside the house collapsed. No one needed an ambulance. When the sun rose, filtered and dull, it found a group of people alive, exhausted, and safe beneath the hill. John stood at the entrance watching the valley wake to another dangerous day. He felt no triumph, no pride, only a quiet certainty. This was why the house existed, not for comfort, not for solitude, but for moments like this, when summer stopped being an inconvenience and became a threat. Behind him, Buddy slept, stretched fully on his side, guarding nothing now but the peace he had helped create. Morning arrived without celebration. It slipped into the valley quietly, filtered through smoke-thinned light, revealing the aftermath of a night that had pressed people together in ways they had not expected. The power was still out. The heat had not relented. But inside the stepped rooms carved into the hill, bodies stirred with a different rhythm, slower, steadier, alive. John rose before most of them, moving carefully so his boots would not echo along the packed earth. He checked the ventilation shaft, adjusted the lanterns, refilled water jugs. The work was familiar now, almost meditative. When he stepped into the lowest level, the air greeted him like a held promise, cool and consistent. He paused there longer than necessary, grounding himself before the day unfolded. The first request came just after sunrise. A pickup truck climbed the trail hesitantly and stopped short of the entrance. A man stepped out, stocky and broad-shouldered, his face reddened by heat and embarrassment. He wore a faded cap pulled low, sweat darkening the fabric around the brim. His name was Daniel Morris, though most people called him Dan. He worked maintenance for a nearby warehouse and had lived in the valley his entire life. Weeks earlier, he had laughed openly when he saw John digging into the hill, joking to anyone who would listen that the newcomer was building a mouse hole. Now Dan stood with his wife and 2 children, eyes avoiding John's. His wife, Rebecca, was slight and pale, her dark hair pulled into a tight knot that did little to hide how exhausted she looked. She held their youngest, a boy of maybe 4, against her shoulder. The child's breathing was quick and shallow, his cheeks flushed. Their older daughter, around 8, clutched a threadbare blanket and stared at the ground, silent. "We heard it was cooler here," Dan said finally, voice rough. If it's full, we'll head back." John did not respond right away. He took in the details instead. The way Rebecca's hands trembled slightly. The way the little boy's legs dangled without energy. The way the daughter leaned unconsciously toward her mother. He remembered the laughter, yes. But he remembered the night more clearly. The heat, the fear, the fragile line between discomfort and danger. "Come in," John said, stepping aside. Dan blinked, surprised. Rebecca exhaled shakily. They followed John inside, descending level by level until the temperature eased enough that Rebecca's shoulders dropped and the child's breathing slowed. The daughter sat down without being told, her eyes widening as relief replaced caution. Buddy approached them calmly. The German shepherd moved with deliberate gentleness, his large frame softened by age and experience. He lay down near the children, positioning his body so they could touch his fur if they wanted without feeling crowded. The little boy reached out first, fingers curling into Buddy's thick coat. Within moments, his breathing steadied. The girl leaned closer, resting her forehead briefly against Buddy's side before sitting back, calmer now. Dan swallowed hard. "Thank you," he said, the words catching. John nodded once. He did not remind Dan of anything that had been said before. He did not need to. By mid-morning, more people arrived. Some came with hesitation, others with urgency. A middle-aged couple whose generator had failed during the night. A thin man with a sunburned neck and hands that shook from dehydration. A woman in her early 30s named Marisol, tall and sharp-featured, her dark hair braided tight down her back, carrying an infant wrapped in damp cloth. Marisol spoke quickly, decisively, the kind of person used to handling crises without waiting for permission. Her baby slept almost immediately once inside. John guided them all with the same quiet efficiency. He showed them where to sit, where to lie down if they needed, where the air moved best. There were no assigned spaces, no rules spoken aloud. People found their places naturally, settling into the stepped levels like stones finding balance in a stream. Buddy remained at the center of it all. He moved when needed, repositioned himself beside those who trembled or breathed too fast, offered his presence without demand. At one point, Louise shuffled in, cane tapping lightly, her broad frame weary but determined. She lowered herself onto a bench with a grunt and smiled faintly at Buddy. "You again," she said. "Guess you're the real caretaker." Buddy thumped his tail once. Sarah arrived shortly after, carrying bags of supplies scavenged from neighbors. Water, electrolyte packets, simple food. She looked different this morning. Tired, yes, but steadier. Her skin still flushed from heat. Freckles darkened across her nose. Her brown hair pulled back into a loose braid that had begun to fray. She moved among the people with quiet confidence, checking on Evan, offering water, speaking in low tones that soothed more than they informed. When she reached John, she paused. "They're not asking anymore," she said quietly. "They're trusting." John glanced around the room. At Dan sitting beside his family, his cap removed now, eyes closed. At Marisol rocking her infant slowly, her breathing even. At strangers who no longer felt like strangers, sharing space without tension. "It's not my house anymore," John said. Sarah nodded. "It never really was." As the afternoon wore on, the heat above intensified. Smoke drifted thicker, casting the valley in a muted orange haze. Sirens wailed intermittently, then faded. But inside the hill, the temperature held. The air moved. Bodies rested. At one point, John caught Dan watching him. When their eyes met, Dan stood awkwardly, hands clasped in front of him. "I said some things," Dan began. "Back when you started digging." John waited. "I was wrong," Dan finished. He did not embellish. He did not explain. He simply said it and nodded. John accepted it with a quiet tilt of his head. Later, a small argument broke out near the entrance. Nothing dramatic, just the tension of fatigue and fear bubbling over. Two men disagreed about space, voices rising briefly. Before John could step in, Buddy stood, placing himself squarely between them. He did not growl. He did not bare his teeth. He simply stood there, solid and unmoving, eyes calm. The men fell silent. Something about the dog's presence reminded them where they were. They backed away, embarrassed, and the tension dissolved as quickly as it had surfaced. As evening approached, the house filled but did not crowd. People adjusted, shifted, made room. Water was shared, food passed hand to hand. No one spoke of ownership. No one asked how long they could stay. The house answered that question on its own. When night fell again, lanterns glowed softly along the walls. Children slept more deeply than they had in days. Older residents rested without the constant effort of regulating breath. The ground did its work, patient and impartial. John sat near the entrance, watching the slow rise and fall of the room's collective breathing. Buddy lay beside him, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. The dog had not left the central space once all day. John thought of Robert then, not with grief, but with clarity. This had never been about a man and his shelter. It had been about understanding what the land could offer if approached without ego, about letting usefulness outweigh pride. Sometime after midnight, John stepped outside briefly to check conditions. The heat pressed against him immediately, thick and unrelenting. Smoke stung his eyes. He did not linger. He returned below, sealing the entrance partially behind him. Inside, the house held. When dawn came again, it found a community that had shifted without ceremony. People stirred, stretched, spoke quietly to one another. The Morris children laughed softly as Buddy rolled onto his back, accepting their careful hands. Marisol smiled for the first time since arriving, her infant sleeping soundly against her chest. John stood at the threshold and realized the truth with a calm certainty. This place no longer belonged to him. It belonged to whoever needed it. And for the first time in a very long while, that felt exactly right. The heat did not disappear after that summer. It loosened its grip, retreated in degrees rather than absolutes, but everyone in the valley understood it would return. Seasons were changing, patterns were shifting. What had once been considered an extreme now felt like a rehearsal. The difference was that the hill was no longer just a place on a map. It was a refuge people could name. By early autumn, the step structure had settled fully into the land. The raw edges were reinforced, the temporary supports replaced with permanent ones. Nothing about it looked grand from a distance. There were no sharp lines or towering walls. The house followed the hill's curves the way water followed stone, each level descending naturally, each space designed to hold air, light, and people without strain. Help arrived quietly. The county sent a small crew first, 2 trucks, no banners. They brought treated timber, proper ventilation grates, and sealants meant to last decades. An engineer named Paul Hendrick supervised the delivery, a tall, lean man in his early 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and a sun-weathered face. Paul spoke carefully, as if every word needed permission to exist. He walked the structure with a clipboard in hand, stopping often, measuring airflow, nodding more than he spoke. "This design," he said finally, tapping the drawings John had kept intact. "It's ahead of most modern solutions. Passive cooling like this. It's what people are trying to rediscover." John watched him work without comment. When funding was discussed, John made one request only. "Don't change the design," he said. "Not the way it works." The county agreed. Construction became communal. Dan Morris returned with tools instead of apologies. He brought his brother, a quiet man with broad hands and a careful way of measuring twice before cutting once. Marisol organized food rotations, her sharp efficiency softening into warmth as she found her footing among the others. Louise supervised from a folding chair, offering commentary no one asked for but everyone secretly relied on. Even Evan showed up after school, notebook tucked under his arm, recording temperatures and airflow like a young apprentice who had found his calling. Sarah was there every day. In the softer light of fall, she looked lighter too, still slender, still practical, but less burdened. Her brown hair was streaked naturally with sun, her skin marked by freckles and fine lines earned honestly. She worked with quiet competence, carrying water, checking on volunteers, stepping in when tensions rose. When John needed another set of hands, she was already there. They did not speak about what the house had become, they simply finished it. When the last structural beam was set, John stepped back and felt something close in his chest. Not pride, not relief, but completion. The stepped rooms breathed evenly now, the ventilation shaft drawing warm air upward without effort. The ground held its cool patiently, ready for the next season, the next need. The sign came later. It was Sarah's idea, though she didn't push it. She mentioned it once while standing beneath the oak tree at the edge of the hill. Buddy stretched lazily in the shade beside her. People keep asking what to call it, she said. They won't stop. John shrugged. It's just the house. She smiled faintly. It's not. The name appeared a week later, carved simply into a wooden marker at the entrance. Robert and Buddy's, steps, no titles, no dates, just two names and a path downward. John said nothing when he saw it. Buddy sniffed the sign once, sneezed, then lay back down, unimpressed. By the following summer, the hill had become part of the valley's rhythm. When heat warnings were issued, people prepared early. They knew where to go. Families arrived with water and blankets. Older residents came before the worst hours set in, settling into the lower levels where air moved gently and bodies could rest without fighting. Children learned quickly where the coolest steps were, where Buddy preferred to lie, where voices naturally softened. Buddy aged another year. His muzzle whitened further, his movements slower but no less purposeful. He no longer patrolled constantly. He didn't need to. He chose a spot near the central level and stayed there, eyes half closed, rising only when someone new arrived or a child cried too sharply. His presence remained enough. John stayed too, not as a hero, not as a caretaker in any official sense. He fixed what needed fixing, kept the paths clear, monitored the structure when storms came. When officials stopped by, he answered questions without embellishment. When reporters called, he declined politely. This place doesn't need a story, he told Sarah once. It just needs to work. She nodded. And it does. On one quiet afternoon, John found himself alone in the lowest level, sunlight filtering faintly through the ventilation shaft above. He sat against the wall, hands resting loosely in his lap, and thought of Robert. Not as a memory frozen in grief, but as a presence that had shaped something living. Robert had not left instructions. He had left understanding. The wars they had fought were different, but the lesson was the same. Survival was not about dominance. It was about adaptation, about listening long enough to hear what the land and the people were asking for. Buddy shifted beside him, pressing his warm weight lightly against John's leg. The dog's breathing was slow, content, untroubled. You did good, John said quietly. He did not specify who he meant. Outside, laughter drifted in from the upper steps. Someone had brought lemonade. Someone else was telling a story that didn't need an ending. The Dian Nguyen, the unfinished wish, had been completed at last. Not with speeches or recognition, but with presence, with a place that held people when they were weakest and asked nothing in return. John rose and climbed the steps slowly, Buddy following at his own pace. At the top, the valley stretched wide and familiar, no longer something to escape or endure. Just home. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or bright light. Sometimes they come quietly, through a piece of land no one wanted, a plan left unfinished, and a dog that refused to walk away. This story reminds us that healing doesn't always mean erasing pain. It means learning how to live with it and letting it become shelter for others. John didn't set out to save anyone. He simply stayed. He listened to the land. He honored what was left behind. And in doing so, he became part of something bigger than his own survival. Maybe that's how God works most often, not by changing the world all at once, but by placing us exactly where we're needed, even when we don't understand why. A cool place in the heat, a steady presence in the chaos, a quiet yes when walking away would be easier. If this story touched your heart, take a moment today to look around you. Who might need shade? Who needs patience? Who needs someone willing to stay? Before you go, please share this story with someone who could use hope. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And subscribe so you don't miss the next story of courage, loyalty, and quiet miracles. May God bless you with peace, strength, and purpose. And may you become someone else's shelter, right where you are.